I'm Ariel Anderson, and I am an author aspiring to write a little bit of something for everybody.
Welcome to Love Letters and Books, a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. This is a soft space to explore romance and books where no topic is too taboo. I'm your host, Casey, and this week I'm sitting down with author Ariel Anderson. Most of you know Ariel from her viral romantic tragedy, a book called Under Your Scars. But today, we're going to drop much deeper into what inspired her to write the book that we simply could not put down. We're going to discuss mental health, self-harm, suicide, and trauma. We'll be taking great care in how we talk about these topics, but I encourage you to be mindful of your own triggers and those around you who may be listening. As someone who was left speechless by Christian and Elena's story, this was the episode I needed to answer my questions and to get to know Ariel as a writer and as a person. And please make sure to stay to the very end, as she has a powerful love letter to share with us today. Ariel, welcome to the Love Letters and Books podcast. I'm so glad you're here with us today.
I'm really excited to be here. It's been a while since I've done like a podcast interview, so I'm excited to kind of give my view on things, I guess.
Oh, well, I'm glad you decided to join us because I picked up your book last year and I went into it kind of blind. Like I knew it was not a happily ever after, but I did not know much more than that. I opened Under Your Scars and I think I read it in one sitting. I was on an emotional roller coaster the entire time. I put the book down and I knew instantly that I wanted to talk to you and learn about what went into this book, what went into the characters, what inspired you, and also the direction you're going to go in with your writing. Because this just, it was so impactful, right? It took social media by storm. People really were moved by this book. And so, with all of that buildup, let me just kind of drop into the book. Can you give us your overview of the book in sort of a short synopsis for anyone who's a little unfamiliar with it?
So the book follows a young aspiring lawyer named Elena and a CEO billionaire named Christian Reeves. And they kind of have this love story that's going on the side. And then there's also this secondary love story that kind of follows this serial killer called the Silencer, who kind of is terrorizing the city that they live in. It's called Meridian City. It's in New Jersey. And it's kind of a story of loving somebody through the worst of them and also through the best of them. And kind of the main overreaching theme of the story is how love corrupts or can corrupt. I shouldn't say it always corrupts, but in ways that you don't really see when you're in it, but other people can see on the outside. And I think in a world where, especially in the dark romance community, where we kind of always focus on these toxic relationships and don't really have conversations about how they're toxic within the book, I think that it's really important that we kind of acknowledge that things aren't always healthy in fiction, and that's okay because it's fiction, but also it's a good thing to kind of acknowledge that writing those things doesn't make it any less real. Some people do experience harmful relationships and they're kind of blind to it. That's a very prominent theme in the novel, is how blind you can be when you're in love with somebody. And I think that really is, I've certainly experienced it in my own life feeling that way. And so I hope that people can see through the regular romance and actually see the bigger overreaching plot of love corrupts.
Very interesting. And this is why I wanted to talk to you, because you could very easily go looking for dark romance, pick up this book and say, oh, it ends in a tragedy, and just leave it there. But there were so many layers to the book as I was reading it. And I was thinking about the complicated relationships. And complicated is probably not the best word to use, but that's what I'm using for this. It was the complicated relationships characters were having with themselves, their inner conflict, some of the family relationships that were really difficult, and then the romantic relationships. So, what inspired you to write such a layered book that might inspire conflict in the readers who maybe thought, why didn't they end up why isn't it the happily ever after? Why? The thing we do as readers. So what
Yeah.
inspired you to write this story?
Well, the very first draft of the book, it was called On My Own, and it was actually a Batman fan fiction that I posted on Tumblr and AO3. And another question I always get is, did it always end that way? And the answer is yes, it always ended the way that it ended. And people are honestly really surprised at that. But I always get the question, was it a Batman fiction? I get Batman vibes. And the answer is yes. So I have a friend named Shelby. She's actually on her own self publishing journey right now. Her book is coming out in November, and she kind of inspired me to write on my own because she had been writing Batman fan fiction as well. And so I decided that I wanted to go on this self publishing journey. And as I was in the very beginning processes of that, my father passed away. And so while I was literally writing the second draft of this novel and kind of removing all of the very obvious Batman elements, I was in this really, really dark sort of depression, and I always say that I took out my grief on the characters because I didn't know how to take it out any other way. And so that's kind of how the book went from kind of this vigilante story to this serial killer, very toxic. I mean, it was toxic in the original story too, but not to the same degree. So it really was inspired by kind of the Batman elements, but then it kind of started going a little bit crazy, I guess I'll say, after my father passed away. And I was kind of just trying to get through this grief in a healthy way for me that I think ended up making the story better. As kind of sad as that sounds, I think that people can really see my grief on the page, especially in the third act of the book, which people honestly sometimes say is the weakest, but I think it's the strongest as far as like my mental state goes because you can really see where I was in my own healing journey and it wasn't a good place. And so that's why I feel like Act 3, even though it maybe is not the strongest from a plot point of view, is the strongest from an emotional point of view.
Oh, I appreciate you sharing all of that with us. And I'm sorry to hear about your father. I know we had spoken briefly about that on our pre production call. And I want to maybe drop into that space
Okay.
of grief, but more so. And I had this conversation yesterday, by the way, with someone I work with where we were talking about their experience with grief and just that year of first that happens after you lose someone and how you're experiencing all of these things, but through a little bit of a different lens. And it's not the same for everyone. I'm not trying to put it under a label, but
Right.
it changes things and you're going through something. That's sort of what you're sharing with us of I was going through grief and I'm writing at the same time. And I'm almost taking it out on the characters. What do you think it was bringing up in you, if you're open to sharing that? Like, what were the emotions or the thoughts that came up during that time that you were adding into the book? I feel like I'm empathizing given my own experiences, and as you're creating something while internally you're going through something you've never gone through before, how does that change it?
Well, when you're writing something, just writing dark romance in general is a very mentally taxing place. I think any author who's written a dark romance novel will tell you that it takes you on a certain mental journey every time you kind of open your document and are writing it. But when you're writing it from a place of grief, I feel like it's a little bit more personal in that you want your grief to feel real and you want the conflict of the novel to feel real, but you also kind of want to have that layer of protection over yourself because I'm very open about my grief journey, but also I'm a reasonably private person and I didn't want I'll just use the best example I can. Elena and her father had a very, I would say, solid relationship for a majority of the book. She thought very highly of him for a majority of the book. He had his issues. My relationship with my own father wasn't necessarily the same. I think, we had our own difficulties and we weren't really on great terms at the time of his passing. So I didn't want the book to become too personal, but I also wanted the grief and the emotions that all the characters were feeling to be real. So finding that balance of like respecting my own boundaries and also making sure that I give the readers the best possible book and best possible representation of all the emotions the characters were going through was a little bit of a challenge and definitely went through a lot of changes as time went on. And like I said, Act 3, again, that was when I was in the most like vulnerable state I was in and the least healthy mental state I was in. And that is really kind of when I was like, okay, all the gloves are off, the boundaries are gone. I'm just gonna write this book because I need to feel these emotions and I need to feel them now or I'm not gonna be okay. And as an author, that's a scary place to be and it's a very vulnerable place to be, especially when it's your debut novel and nobody really knows who you are. It can be very scary, but I'm glad that I did it. And I people sometimes ask me if I regret ending it the way that I did, or maybe not regret, but wish I had ended it a different way as far as like appealing to the masses. And I always say no, because that was the state I was in. And I think there's something really beautiful about going from being in that vulnerable place to kind of being able to talk about it in a healthier way, because when I had first published a book, there's no way you and I could have a conversation
Yeah.
like this, and I'd be okay to have a conversation like this. Not that I've never not been open about it, but just like I was too kind of emotional to process those emotions. But now that I've done it and I've seen the impacts the Underscars has had and had messages of how it's affected other people, I am so glad that I followed my gut instinct and said, "This book needs to be a tragedy. It needs to stay a tragedy, and that's going to make this book all the more beautiful," is the tragic part of it.
What is it like to affect people that way with a piece of your writing where you are stirring up such big emotions? You are highlighting topics that people tend to maybe either romanticize or glaze over, but you really dropped into them. And what is that like to know that you've had such an emotional impact on so many readers?
It is a very humbling experience, I think is the best way I can put it, because I didn't publish that novel with the intention of it really going anywhere, and this is something that I think I've only shared publicly one other time, but Under Your Scars was my suicide note. My intention with Under Your Scars when I hit publish was, I'm publishing this book, and if something comes of it, I want the money to go to my family. But when I started getting the feedback from my ARC readers and people started reaching out and saying, wow, this book affected me in this way, in a very deeply personal way, and started sharing their own stories of their own grief and the things that they had been through, I was like, wow, I really have something going here. And that is really like what changed everything for me. I was like, maybe this is what I'm meant to be here for. Yes, it was a difficult process and I was in a really difficult emotional state, but to see all those messages and to continue to see those messages, I mean, I get these all the time. And when I was at a convention just this past week, and people came up to me and would tell me these deeply personal stories to my face, which isn't easy. It's not easy telling a stranger, practically a stranger, all these deeply emotional stories about yourself. And I'm very honored that people feel comfortable enough to share those things with me. And again, it's a very humbling experience to know that something I wrote in my grief positively affected people. I think critics of the novel think that I've heard that I've done harm to the community by ending it in a tragedy, and I've heard people say some pretty harsh things about me because of the way I ended the novel, but to those critics I always say your words do not overshadow people's real life experiences that they've shared with me. And I have hundreds, if not thousands, of more really, really personal stories about how the book positively affected people versus, the few people that might be really loud on social media criticizing what the book is about. And so I think that's a very special place to be. I mean, criticism is not easy for anybody, but I think that I've really learned to kind of clutch to the people that have told me that I've made a difference in their life, whether it was big or small. That's always been really special. And like I said, I remember all of those conversations and I care very deeply about the people who share those things with me. And Yeah, humbling is the best way I could put it.
Well, it's going to be the word of the day because I'm pretty humbled that you shared that with us here. And I really appreciate you opening up and sharing that. And just from what you said, it made me think of the book in a whole new way. And I was not one of the critics, obviously, because I reached out to you and told you I love the book. But I think I'm seeing it through a different lens with what you just shared. And I don't know, criticism in general is an interesting thing and how freely people offer it. So just looking at it from a position of neutrality, it's interesting. I think my feeling was that what you wrote was really helpful. It was very humanizing in a lot of ways. And I think one of the most impactful lines for people, what I've seen so much on social media, is the moment when Christian says, just turn around and count to 100 and I'll get you some pancakes. And that really resonated with people because it's the part of this type of story that we're not usually privy to. And it was very vulnerable and intimate and private and sad and emotional in very full circle in a way where we've started the book in one way and we're almost ending it in the way that the story was almost unfolding in the beginning. So I appreciate how much you're sharing and how generous you are with your readers who are having such a big response to this because these are topics that are not always spoken about. And so when you're talking about things like toxic relationships, there were elements of self harm in the book, suicide. What care do you take for yourself first as the writer, as you're writing about these topics? Was there anything that you did to support yourself through that? And I guess my follow up question is how do you take care of this anonymous audience that you're putting this book out to? What did you put into the book to make sure that there was a lot of care in there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Because it felt it didn't feel flippant. It felt like there was intention in the book and that it was very carefully done. I could be wrong about that. That's how I felt as a reader. I felt very safe reading a tragedy.
So to answer the first part of your question, as far as how I took care of myself, I really think just writing the book was me taking care of myself because, like I said, it was my coping mechanism. And of course, not everything that I ended up writing ended up in the final novel. The book definitely went through a lot of changes and a lot of scenes that were probably a little bit too intense for mass market audiences. Definitely got taken out. But writing the book was definitely my form of therapy. And I was in therapy at the time, but writing really was what got me through what I was going through. And I think as far as my readers, they really appreciate seeing somebody in a very public way that's very open to criticism be vulnerable like that because being vulnerable is very scary. And being vulnerable on a public platform, I'll tell you right now, is very scary and a little bit difficult at times because sometimes I just want to shake people and be like, just listen to me, just understand where I'm coming from. But not everybody wants to listen.
Yeah.
And that's okay. The book is not for everybody, and that's okay. And not everybody is reading a book to, understand the deeper issues that the author is going through at the time. Sometimes they just want to read for fun, and that's okay too. But I do sometimes wish that I could go to people who maybe didn't fully understand where I was coming from when I was writing the story and just be like, just listen to me for 5 minutes. Let me tell you what I was going through. And then, look at the book through a different lens as opposed to just looking at it through a form of entertainment fiction and understand that while it is technically a form of entertainment and literature, it was a very personal healing process for me. And I think that's where readers find that I took care in it is just because the emotions in that are real. They're not forced emotions. Yes, some of the scenarios might be made up and we have some suspension of disbelief in the ways that some things happened in the book, but the emotions were real, and I think that's what people really appreciate. I know sometimes I've read books before, maybe not in this space, but just in general in my life. You can kind of feel it that the author wasn't really feeling the emotions that they were writing. They're just kind of trying to I guess, fill the page in the best way that they knew how. But when you're writing from a place where the emotions are real, you can tell. You can see it on the page. People tell me all the time, like, I felt your grief coming through these pages. And I think that's why they appreciate it so much, even though it's a very hard topic to read, or a lot of the topics are very difficult to read, and very sensitive topics that have a lot of negative emotions in people's lives. I think that people just really appreciate how I took care in trying to make him as real as possible, and that's really all I can say, is that I was going through it at the time, and those were my real emotions on the page. Even though there might be made up scenarios, those are real emotions.
Mm.
And that's what I think that's what readers really appreciate.
It's probably why it just feels so authentic, and it really offered your readers an opportunity to drop into those emotions as well. And it's something I think I look for in books where I can be perhaps not an emotional person in my real life. I feel like that's what books offer me, and I really, really appreciate that. And it makes me wonder, is there something more about you as a person or a writer that we may not know? It may not be obvious to us from the outside that you would want to share, or something that you want people to know about yourself?
I'm a reasonably private person. I don't necessarily talk
Mhm.
about like my family life, but as far as like who I am as a person, I feel like people know that I'm kind of a goofball in real life. And like just this past week when I was at my convention in Tennessee, people were like looking at me and like, I can't believe that you wrote this kind of book. And I'm like, I get that all the time because people associate like dark romance authors with kind of this like gothic, sort of dark, sexy aesthetic. And I'm kind of like, I love pink and glitter and, wearing dresses and heels and curling my hair. And people just are they're kind of in like culture shock of like, wow, how did this girl that loves all this pink and glitter write such a hard novel? But also, again, I think that's part of the beauty of the novel, is that people are seeing like, I was in such this horrible dark place when I was writing it, but this is who I am now 2 years later. Book came out in 2023. My father passed away in 2022. So we're at the end of 2025 now. And it's been about 3 years since I went through that really difficult time in my life. And this is where I am now. And I think there's beauty in seeing that, I'm okay with being who I am in a very full and authentic way, while also acknowledging that I went through a very difficult time. And this is who I became out of that. And I guess, don't judge a book by its cover, I guess, is the best way you can put it, because, sometimes you look at somebody and you think, they've not really been through something, but maybe you look at me and you just see me walking down the street and you're like, this girl's got it all. She's, walking with confidence on the street. But there was a time when that was not me. There was a time when I was curled up in blankets and unable to get out of bed. Or, there was a time when I was writing the book where I was working at a law firm and I handed in my 2 weeks notice and I was like, I can't do this. Like, I cannot function as a human being right now because I'm in so much grief, and it's affecting my work life, it's affecting my personal life. And I guess what I'm trying to say is just like, I am a different person now than when I wrote that book. She's still in there, but I am glad that I've grown from that, and I feel more myself now than I ever have before. And something that my husband always tells me from the first time I went to my very first book signing convention, he says, "This is where you are meant to be." Because I was always a very introverted person and shy, and I didn't really like talking to people. But he saw me at my very first book convention in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was like, "The way you were talking to these people and interacting with these people, I've never seen you more alive than when you did that." And I think that's a testament to, one, how much the book affected myself and my readers, because we were able to connect in a very vulnerable way. It, of course, was emotional, but it wasn't, weird. And, people felt comfortable sharing those things with me. And so when he said that, I was like, you know what? You're right. Like, I've never felt more alive than I do right now interacting with people, and I love writing stories, and I love sharing not just Under Your Scars as a book, but sharing the greater message of Under Your Scars and like what it has done to and for the community. I think that's something very special that nobody, including myself, ever expected to happen. And I mean, looking back on it, I'm like, I don't know how we got here, but I'm glad we are. Like, I'm glad we're here, not just because, on your scars is viral, but like under your scars, I don't care what anybody says, has done a lot of good for this community. And I am very, very proud of that story for bringing this community together in a way that I've never really seen the community rally before. I'm sure it's happened, but at least in, I guess, my lifetime on Bookstagram, I've never seen, a book affect people in such a deep, personal way.
Well, that leads me to think about the power of romantic tragedy and the power of dark romance, and that they're not one and the same, but that there's space for each. So, not limiting you to one subgenre, but why do you think the romantic tragedy is the one that had such a big impact? And it did go viral and it still inspires conversation. And why do you think that part of the book resonated with people so much?
Let me try to say this in the best way possible because I know people get very heated about this topic. Romance is one very big, beautiful genre. And I think that most people can appreciate the non HEA kind of reflecting real life. And a lot of people say it's not an HEA, it's not a happily ever after. But for example, my parents were married for 50 years and my father passed away shortly after my mother passed away. And are you going to tell me that their love story is not a happily ever after just because, of the way that things ended between them? Of course not. Like, of course, that was a big, beautiful love story. And I think there's space in the romance community for people to kind of experiment with endings that are not expected. I think you definitely have to warn your readers that that's coming. I always try to do that, whether or not the critics agree that I've done that in an effective way. I've said the Amazon description says that it's not a happily ever after. The trigger warning page says that it's a romantic tragedy. There's a post on my page with all the trigger warnings in detail that says that there's, these on page events that happen. And, while I've tried to be true to the story, I don't think that just because it doesn't have the traditional HEA doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a romance. And actually, I would argue that it's the ultimate HEA because what is more romantic in the book space than following your lover into the afterlife? That's what I would argue. And some people disagree, and that's okay. But I think that if you're saying that the book is a romance until the very last page, I feel like that's a very narrow-minded way of kind of looking at this big, beautiful genre. And if no HEA is not for you, there are like 800 billion other romance books that you could read that are for you, and that's okay. But I don't think that we should limit authors in any way on what they feel is best for their story. And I also think that HEA is subjective because I've actually seen this topic before, not even necessarily related to my book, but somebody on one of the Facebook groups that I'm in had posted something like, "What is HEA to you?" And one person had said, I can't remember their exact phrasing, but they had said something like, as long as they're together, it doesn't matter if they're happy about it. And I'm like, well, that's not HEA to me. Like, if one or both of them is not happy that they're in a relationship, like, that's not an HEA to me. And so, I think you should go into it with an open mind if it's something that you're interested in. But also, I understand if it's not for you, and that's okay. I just think that don't knock it before you try it, I guess. Like I said, romance is a big, beautiful genre filled with many, many things, and I don't think you should yuck somebody else's yum. And from a personal standpoint, I don't think you can really knock me for ending the book the way I did, knowing where I was in my mental journey. And maybe you think that's an excuse and maybe you don't, but I think that if you look at it through that lens, then you kind of understand better, like, oh, she didn't just end it this way for the shock value. She ended it this way because she was going through something. I just think that I would hope that people could be open-minded and kind of look past the, oh, romance has to end in an HEA where they have to, be together and get married and everything's, sunshine and rainbows, because there are hundreds of ways to have a happily ever after, and it's not just one way. And I think, again, that's the beauty of romance, is that there's so many ways you could end it. And again, it's so subjective. Some people think that some things are HAs and some people don't. So it really is a subjective thing. And I think you should go into romance, any romance, with an open mind. And one of the things that I've kind of seen other authors doing is I feel like, not to say that I've inspired this movement, but I feel like the virality of Under Your Scars has inspired other authors to kind of be more okay with experimenting in their writing. I've seen at least 4 other relatively big authors kind of going towards the non-HEA route and still calling it a romance, and, that's a whole other debate. I commend those authors because they're in for one heck of a criticism coming their way, but I commend the authors that are really just kind of like, "You know what? I'm going for it. I'm writing the ending that I wanna write. I'm writing the ending that's best for these characters." And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna be married and have babies, you know? There are a million ways to have it happily ever after, and there are a million ways to not have it happily ever after, and it's really just, what are you prepared to read? I guess what I'm trying to say is, where does love end for you when you're reading a book? Does it end if a character dies? Does it end in eternity if you believe in an afterlife? Are they in the afterlife together and you believe that that's their happily ever after? It really is a subjective thing, and I wish more people thought about it in that way as opposed to saying, "Oh, romance needs a happily ever after to be a romance," because I don't necessarily agree.
Oh, I love that you're talking about this. One of the things that I'm getting from what you're saying is that there are so many parallels also in real life of when we instantly say that something's not for me, or that's not what I wanted, or that's not what I was looking for. It's like it's almost an invitation to step in for a second and say, what about that thing is causing that reaction in me? So you wrote this big, beautiful love story. It's very emotional. It takes us places. So if it's inspiring that response, that's an invitation to drop into ourselves and say, like, what is that stirring up in me? What is that making me think about? And I really love that. And then one of the other parallels that I'm picking up is something that we talk about often on this podcast, where our experience with reading and books and authors goes so far beyond just what's between the pages. It inspires us to reflect on our own lives. And so, as I'm hearing you talk about staying true to the story as it was coming to you and as it was moving through your life at a very specific time, and honoring that instead of trying to make yourself more marketable or more attractive, things that a lot of us are programmed to do. I just as women, we're programmed almost to do that. We're taught to do that. We're told we have to do that. And so I'm hearing this call to stepping into authenticity and being okay with it, and being okay if not everyone in that exact moment is ready to receive you. And I think that that's a really important lesson in all of this. And it goes far beyond just picking up a book and reading. And I think that that's the power of storytelling, which is why I started this podcast. I love when women are sharing their stories. I think it's really powerful. And as you're sharing this story that's very complicated and very challenging, bring up big emotions, I think it's that invitation to step in and say, what does that bring up in me? How does that filter how I'm looking at this story? And I just really appreciate it. So I'm excited that you're willing to talk about it today. And I'm also thinking about your journey as a writer, because to me, this is really bold to have this book be that first novel that you're putting out there. And that's just my perspective. It doesn't have to be your feeling, but I'm wondering about that moment, and there's many moments leading up to it, but that moment when you hit publish and it's no longer this secret that you're keeping and it's out there in
Mhm.
the world. And then just by nature of it being observed by others, it changes to some degree, right? Because people are filtering it. What is that moment like for you?
Very scary. Anytime you put yourself out there in a way that's kind of designed to be criticized, like, when I say that, I mean, like, there's Goodreads and there's Storygraph, and there's all these ways that readers can connect with each other and kind of say, "This is what I loved about the book, this is what I hated about the book." And not to mention that there are some readers out there that believe that they need to tell you that directly, and so they email you or direct message you all the ways that they hated what you wrote. So you kind of have to, I wouldn't say develop a thick skin. I would just say you have to be able to take those things with a grain of salt because, again, what somebody hated, somebody else will love. That really is just the dichotomy of being an author is that you're not going to get everybody, and that's okay. I mean, look at the most famous books of all time. If you go to their Goodreads, there are thousands and thousands of negative reviews on those kinds of books, like Song of Ice and Fire, Lord of the Rings, I don't know, Hunger Games, like all of these very big kind of defining books in the world all have negative criticisms about them. And so you can't, I think it's not fair to yourself or to your readers to say that you're going to be different. I think, again, you don't need to have a thick skin, but you definitely need to understand that most people are criticizing you from a place of their own lived experience. And some people have higher standards for their fiction than others, and that's okay. So while it is a scary thing, I also think authors can benefit from kind of maybe not obsessing over their negative reviews, but I think that it's worth it to, at least when you're first starting out, kind of going through your 3, 2, and 1 star reviews and finding out what people didn't resonate with. I think there is something very valuable in that kind of feedback. As long as it's, constructive feedback. Obviously, there's going to be people out there who are just going to, they're going to say negative things just to say negative things. But if somebody is coming from a place of, here's what I didn't like about the book, and here's why I didn't like it about the book, I think there's really valuable feedback in that. And I certainly took that to heart after publishing Under Your Scars. Not that I'm going to write anything like Under Your Scars ever again, but, it was my debut novel. And so I was still learning about the industry, and I was still kind of learning where I fit in the world. And I really took those criticisms to heart. And I was talking about this the other day on a different podcast that I was on, where when I first published Under Your Scars, I would actually go through every single review and I would actually like it on Goodreads so that people knew that I had read it. And it was kind of meant to be like an acknowledgement of like, I hear what you're saying, but like now looking back, I'm like, God, that is so cringe. Why did I do that? Because like, I'm sure some people saw me liking that and were like, I'm sure some people thought that I was doing that to be petty. And I really didn't, it didn't come from that kind of place, but like I can see why people would think that now. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I do that? But I do think that I got some valuable criticisms from that. So if I could give any advice to, aspiring authors, I'd be like, take those with a grain of salt, but also take them into consideration if they're constructive. Your critics are some of your best ways to develop your writing. And I encourage people to take those to heart. Maybe not necessarily like reading them until you hurt your own feelings, because I've definitely been there before, but just, writing is an art and a skill, and it needs to be developed just like any skill. And those people can really help you develop your skill if you're open to that kind of criticism. So while it's a scary moment to hit publish, I also think it's very liberating to be like, I can finally be done with this freaking project and it can just be off of my plate. I know I certainly feel that way with some of my books that I'm writing right now. I'm like, I'm just ready to get this off of my plate. I want to move on to something else. It's liberating, but it's also really fun because there are ride or die people out there that are going to love whatever you write. And those are always so much fun to read, those reviews and interacting with those people, especially for somebody like me who writes in a bunch of different genres or is trying to write in a bunch of different genres. It's really fun to see like what people resonate with and the themes that people resonate with. And honestly, what people think my skills are as a writer. I really enjoy reading all of those things. So people say don't read your reviews, but I argue you should read your reviews, at least in some capacity. Don't read them till you hurt your own feelings, but definitely read some of them.
Oh, I think that's really powerful advice, and I'm going to take that with me. Don't read them until you hurt your own feelings. So, just side note, I work in medical media and I do a lot of writing and editing. And when someone complains about me, they email my boss directly. That is also a unique way to experience feedback, is to have it go directly to your boss, who is very benevolent as she shares it with me, but very scary too.
So I appreciate you shared all of that. In our conversation, we're almost closing the chapter on Under Your Scars. Can you leave us with one thing that you loved about Christian and Elena as characters? One thing you loved about each of them?
Well, I feel like Christian is the easier place to start just because he is such a complex character. And I think if I had to say one thing about Christian, it would be that the story really happens to him. I always say that, yes, a lot of really horrible things happen to Elena, and the story is kind of built to center around her experience of falling in love with Christian and the Silencer. But the story really happens to Christian. It opens with him in his suicide letter, and then it closes with him in this really dark moment in his life, and it all kind of comes full circle. And I think that Christian is a very tragic character. Of course, the whole book is a tragedy, but he is really the tragic character of the book. And I think that people really appreciate how dynamic he is as a person because, he has moments where he's maybe not understanding where other people are coming from. And he has moments where he's really vulnerable and he's just a human like the rest of us are. And he's a very distressed human and a very complex, medically complex human, or I should say, mentally complex human. And I think that people really appreciate that his rawness and his ability to feel emotions in a world and in a genre where we kind of put these men on a pedestal that are supposed to be stoic and hard and always strong for their woman. I think people can really resonate with the fact that he was not always that way and he was actually in some ways the one that needed to be comforted. And I feel like you don't really see that a lot in dark romance specifically. I feel like you see it more in like contemporary romance of like men being more vulnerable, but in dark romance, I feel like we as readers really seek out men that kind of fix everything for us as opposed to us being the fixers. I feel like the nature of being a woman, I feel like Bethany said something along these lines in the actual book, but like the nature of being a woman is always like fixing everybody else's problems. And so, I feel like we try to escape that in fiction in a way, but I think that it's okay to feel a man in a dark romance novel needing help in ways that Elena can't necessarily help him. He needed professional help. He didn't just need Elena, but he was obviously a very stubborn person and didn't want to get that help. And that ultimately, I think, was part of the reason why his story ended up being so tragic. I really love Christian for the fact that he is a very real human and went through a lot of complex emotions. And fun fact, or maybe not so fun fact, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but the multiple personality thing, it was something that I got added actually way later. Like he was obviously always like he always had this alter ego, but the actual like mental diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder came much later in the writing process because I was like, this is a very unique thing to kind of highlight in a romance novel. And not that I'm, necessarily went into like all the clinical complexities of it, but just to highlight the way that trauma can really affect a young person into their adulthood, I think was also something readers really appreciated. And I just love Christian. He's a cool guy, but a very unique and very relatable character, I feel like, in a way. I've actually had a lot of male readers tell me I related to Christian because of the way that he defended the things that he loved with his life. And a lot of men really resonated with him. And again, my husband always says, like, if this book was made into a movie, which, that's the goal for everybody. He's like, if this book was made into a movie, I feel like it would resonate with men more than it would with women because of Christian. And I think that's just such a cool thing. And to hear other men say that, and not just men that, are supposed to tell me that, my book is perfect all the time, say that, they really resonated with Christian, I think is really cool. Especially coming from a woman, like, what do I know about the lived male experience? So to hear other men say that I wrote a really accurate representation of, I guess, the male psyche is really interesting. And to close that off, I guess we can move into Elena. And I think that most people find that Elena's strength is really beautiful. Like, she went through all of these really horrible things in this book, and I feel like her coming out of it is representative of like how we all kind of are expected to move on when horrible things happen. Like, nobody really gives us space to kind of heal from our traumas, especially our own selves. Like, I feel like that's something that people kind of overlook is like you also have to give yourself space to heal from these things. And if you don't do that, other people can only help you so far. You also have to help yourself. And I think that people really appreciated Elena's kind of roller coaster journey of healing through all these things that she went through, because there were some days where she had high days and some days where she had low days, and it wasn't really this linear progression of healing that she went through, especially in like act 2 and 3 of the book. A lot of what she went through is unfortunately a very common thing for a lot of women to go through, and so I tried to approach that with delicacy. And as far as like her healing journey from her sexual assault, I feel like, again, a lot of readers have reached out to me and said this was so real, because in fiction and especially dark romance, you kind of only see the don't touch me side of that healing process. You don't see the I want to be loved and I want to be touched side. And I feel like a lot of people really resonated with her journey in that way of like she wanted things that her body was not ready for. And I think that was a very dynamic, and I use the term beautiful as like in a very sensitive way,
Mhm.
because obviously what she went through was not beautiful, and it's one of the most horrific things I think any person can go through. But healing in itself, I think, is a beautiful thing, especially from something so horrific and something that affects you so deeply on like both a physical and mental level. She was definitely a little bit more delicate after she came out of that, or I guess partially came out of it, but she was also, one of the strongest characters I'll probably ever write, just because she acknowledged how she felt and she owned it. And I think readers really resonate with her in that way of like, it's okay for me to say, to like have these boundaries, but also say like, I don't necessarily want these boundaries. This is just like part of my journey, and that's okay. Like, I think a lot, I say that a lot in this podcast, but that really is another of like the bigger messages of Under Your Scars is that it's okay to not be okay. People say that all the time, but nobody really allows themselves to feel that
Yeah.
way. Because people can say things all day long. People can say it's okay to not be okay all day long. But until you really feel that yourself, it's never going to really impact you. And so I think that is another thing that really resonates with people when they read the book is like, I am okay with being in this moment in my life where I'm not okay. And while Christian and Elena's story ended in a tragedy, my story as the author, thankfully, didn't. And I feel like people can really resonate and appreciate that, like, wow, this author or this person that, is a complete stranger to me went through all these horrible things and came out of it in a way that is very relatable, I feel like, to a lot of people. And again, people share their stories with me, which is really difficult and scary. And people really don't have to do that. They could easily just say, I love the book and leave it at that. But, people are vulnerable, and, it's not easy to tell people about horrible things that you've been through in your life, but to reach out to somebody that you don't know and tell them, hey, something you've written really resonated with me in multiple ways, I think is, again, really, really beautiful. And so I think as far as the female experience goes, I feel like all of us can see a little bit of ourselves in Elena, whether that's, her strength or even her weaknesses.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of my favorite things about Elena. And I don't necessarily see myself in Elena, but I see myself in the things that she was feeling, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. And I feel like that could be one of the big takeaways of this podcast episode that maybe someone listening today just needed to hear that it's okay to not be okay and for that to come across with sincerity. Because very often that can be a message, right, that we say
Oh,
or
yeah.
is said to us, but the undercurrent can sometimes be, but just do it quickly, or like get through it pretty quickly.
Mhm.
Or we can do that to ourselves. I'm sitting here listening to you talk, totally understanding why I resonated with your book so much because of just how you come across and how you're speaking about this, and thinking about times when I have not allowed myself to not be okay, even if I was telling myself I was. So you're just inspiring a lot of self inquiry. And I hope that anyone listening to this episode feels that and feels really safe in asking themselves those questions of how could I be more accepting of this? How could I make space for my full range of emotions and experiences? So I really
Mhm.
appreciate that you dropped into that space with us because you don't even know me. And we're having this beautiful conversation, which I feel like is going so far beyond just talking about a book. And I really appreciate that. And one of the other things I wanted to touch on that stood out to me so much when I was doing my research about you was that you continue to donate a portion of your royalties to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I would love to just take a moment and talk about that, why that's important and why that is so meaningful to you.
Suicide has deeply affected me on a very personal level. I lost my father to suicide in 2022, November of 2022, which is why I make my yearly donation in November as kind of to honor him and in his remembrance. But I also make donations throughout the year. Like just this past week, I went to Tennessee LitCon and I sold little pins and bracelets for $5 each, and 100% of those proceeds went to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We raised, I think it was $70, and then I matched it 100%. And then last year, when I went to the Romance Era experience, I think we raised $100, and then I also matched that, or maybe it was $200. I can't remember. But anyway, the point is, like, while I do make that donation every November, I also really try to throughout the year also make other contributions, whether that's through like a community effort or if it's just like I'm feeling some kind of way that month or that day, and I'm like, I feel like the foundation could really benefit from an additional donation. But yeah, I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish. And outside of just my own donations, the kind of movement that Under Your Scars has inspired, I've seen so many people like walk 5Ks for suicide awareness and hold their own fundraisers for it outside of me, like unrelated to me completely. Like, yeah, they'll tag me in their posts, but they're doing that themselves. Like, they're organizing, they're rallying together as a community for their own community for this cause that affects so many of us. Like, I don't really think people really understood how many people were really touched by suicide until the community kind of came together and said, look at this book and how it highlighted this message and how this author took this horrible thing that happened to her and kind of turned it into this very vulnerable tragedy. While, yes, it's sad, but also like it's a message of healing as far as the author goes. And I think that's just really cool to watch the community kind of rally together and also support each other.
Mhm.
And also, to that effect, so last November, I donated $10,000 to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. That was based on my total yearly royalties. This year, in November, I plan on donating 15,000, which is amazing. Like, I can't even believe I'm saying that number. But I always try to say that even if you didn't like Under Your Scars or any of my other books, I donate, it's all encompassing of all my books. It's not just Under Your Scars, but even if you didn't like those books, even if you don't like me as a person, even if you hate the message of Under Your Scars, the fact that you even read a single page means that your engagement of my work is also affecting a cause that's greater than all of us. This cause is greater than me as the author, a cause that's greater than our community. It's a cause that is something that affects the entire world. And I think that's something that's really cool to say. Like, yes, you're supporting me by reading my books, but maybe you don't end up liking my books. And you still feel like you came out on top because you contributed to a cause that was greater than all of us by reading even just one page of my books. I just think that that's really cool, and I will continue to do that for the rest of my life. This is my full time job right now, but even if in the future it doesn't end up being my full time job, That's still something I'm going to do. It's something I've done since day one. I donated my very first royalty check to the well, it wasn't the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It was a Texas-based organization. But I've done that since day one, practically before anybody even knew who I was. I mean, I think that first royalty check was like less than $100, and I donated it all because it was like, this cause is really important to me. I was still kind of in that headspace of like, I don't know if I want to be on this earth anymore. I need to do something that's bigger than myself. And I really hope that people can see my sincerity when it comes to this cause in particular. Writing is my job and it is my passion, but it is a way for me to contribute to a cause that's bigger than me. And I cherish that every single day. And to think that last year I donated $10,000 and this year I plan on donating $15,000 is crazy. Like, that is crazy. That's a crazy number. For a lot of people, that's their entire like yearly salary for some people. And to say that like enough readers resonated with my book to be able to donate that to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is amazing. And I've reached out to some representatives from that organization and they're all extremely kind. And so I want people to know that your donations really are making a difference in people's lives and they are really appreciated, not just by me, the author, but like the actual people that these donations are going to are really, they really, really appreciate that. And when I was speaking to the representative, I had said, like, nobody really rallies behind a cause better than romance readers. Like, I feel like romance readers, we have our share of faults, but we really do rally behind causes with our full chests. And I tried to highlight that with them. I was like, if you really want a cause to have meaning, get the romance readers to stand behind it because they will really do everything in their power. And I just think that's so cool. And again, like, it's a cause that's really important to me, and to see so many people supporting it and supporting me at the same time is really cool. And again, the word of the day is humbling, really humbling to feel that way. And I really hope that people understand that you're not just supporting me, you're supporting something much, much bigger than me. I hope people find comfort in that. Like, again, even if they didn't end up liking the book, it's, or books, or me, it's something really special.
Oh, it's so beautiful. And I'm so glad we took time to talk about that because I feel like when people are modeling something that is so true to them, I feel like it's important to give that space. And I feel like someone listening is going to take so much from what you've shared today. And I'd love to talk about some things that are going on for you, some recent things that have been happening, and what is coming up for you in the future. I know that you recently this summer had another book published and you have some things going on with audiobooks and next books. So I'd like to give you the floor to touch on some of the things that you've been working on.
Yeah, so just this past July, I had my first contemporary romance come out, and that was a lot of fun. It's called Venus. It's kind of like a rom-com between a firefighter and a nurse, and that was a lot of fun to write because my husband is a firefighter. And so it was kind of based on, I wrote this in the acknowledgments, but it's kind of based on like his experience with his fire academy class. So that was really fun to write, to kind of reflect on like some of the banter that I've heard. That was just kind of more of a like fun kind of thing. It wasn't really meant to be like a bigger message, like kind of like Under Scars. It was really meant to be like a fun, feel good novel. And there are some sad things that happen in that book, but it was really meant to be something lighthearted and kind of a palate cleanser if you're just coming off of the intense roller coaster of Under Your Scars. So that was really fun to write, and that one's already available in audio. I also had King of the Damned come out in April, which is a vampire romance. I always describe it as star-crossed lovers meet vampires. And that audiobook actually just came out Tuesday, the 16th of September. So that's really cool. And that one's a full cast audio, and all of the cast did amazing on that one. The second and final book of that series comes out in November, which is really awesome. And then as far as 2026 goes, I have, I think, 5 books lined up, pretty much ready to go, just like one after the other in 2026. I'm really excited. I'm kind of returning to my tragedy era in a couple of those books. I'm just kind of trying to establish my direction as a writer. Like, I experimented with Venus in King of the Damned, and I figured out what my strengths were and what my weaknesses were. And I feel like, you know what? I just really have a penchant for tragedy and angst, and I think I'm gonna kind of just lean into that, and I'm gonna go for it. And they're not all necessarily based in the real world, but I'm really excited to share some of these new stories that I have, because behind the scenes, it's really hard sometimes to like be an author and have like pretty much a full book written and not really be in the space to be able to share it
Yeah.
at the moment, because I also want to give like my current books their time to shine, so I don't want to like share new books when a book already just came out. Like I didn't want to share some of my new tragedies when King of the Dam just came out. So but I'm really excited for what I have coming in 2026, and I think a lot of people will really see how I've developed as a writer. While Venus and King of the Damned are not necessarily like my peak writing abilities, they were really important in my journey to figure out where I fit in and what my strengths are. And I think I found them. And so I'm really excited to share those strengths with my readers and, hopefully kind of reach new readers in that way. Writing in whatever genre just feels right, like
Yeah.
not sticking to a single genre. A lot of people say that you should have a different pen name if you're going to write in a different genre, but I don't necessarily agree. I think that if you do it right, you're going to have people that are going to read whatever you write, and that's really cool. And I don't want to limit myself, and I don't want to, frankly, I'm a little bit too lazy to completely start over from scratch with a new pen name. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And I'm really excited for what I have coming soon. But Queen of the Wicked's coming out in November. That'll be the last book I'll publish in 2025. And I'll just say that I'm ready to get that one off my plate. I'll just say that.
Well, I think we're ready to read it. So that's exciting. And I'm definitely one of those readers who, when I love one book from an author, I do a deep dive into the whole catalog. So I appreciate you keeping it all under one name so I don't have to do deep, in depth research. And I can't wait for what you
Yeah,
have coming up. And Ariel, when I invited you on the podcast, one of the things I mentioned was that all of the authors who join me here are asked to write and read a love letter, either to their younger selves or to their readers. So I wanted to give you this space to read your love letter.
I'm a little bit nervous about this one. I didn't really write it down because I wanted it to kind of feel like it was coming more from the heart. But my love letter is both to my past self and then like people who might be going through kind of some of the emotions that I was going through when I was writing Under Your Scars. And really, all I have to say is keep going. It's hard, and I know it's hard, and you're gonna have days where it's gonna feel impossible, but keep going, because there's something really beautiful, I think, waiting. Sorry. There's something really beautiful waiting on the other side for you if you can make it through that, if you can find the strength. And I do appreciate people who say that, like, my book helped them through whatever they were going through in their life, but you guys did that yourself. Like, you made it through the difficult part yourself. That wasn't me. That was all you. And so just keep going. That's all I really have to say is just keep going. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. We're both crying. I'm not supposed to be crying, so it's okay. And I really appreciate that you said that. You never know when you put out an episode when someone hears it. So I hope that someone hears it the exact moment they need it.
I do too. I
Yeah.
really do. And I hope that, any sort of uplifting message finds somebody in a moment that they need it, whether it's mine or somebody else's. Like, you never know what's going to affect somebody, and you never know what's going to resonate with somebody. And, sometimes it's the smallest of messages or the smallest of things that show up on your Instagram feed that can really make all the difference. So I just hope that, there's something out there for everyone to keep you going. And I hope that you find the strength to keep going for one more day, because that thing could be right around the corner. Or, that coping mechanism could be writing your own book and making your own difference in the world. And there's so many beautiful ways that you can come out of that. And even if you're not okay right now, it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to figure out what works for you. And grief is not a one size fits all approach. It's not a one size fits all healing process. And, what works for somebody might not work for somebody else. I really hope anybody listening
Yeah.
knows that they're not alone in their feelings, and they're definitely not alone in their journey. And if you look, you will find people who are willing to listen or willing to share their own stories in hopes that it uplifts you. And I said this in my acknowledgments of Under Your Scars, but, as Christian believes he owes his life to Elena, I believe I owe my life to the reader. And I hope that anybody listening will find their own kind of that sort of sentiment in something in their life, whether it's, a book or a movie or another person or their own love. Like, there's so many beautiful ways to come out of grief. And, it's not a linear journey, but it really is. It's really beautiful on the other side. And so I hope everybody listening finds a way to keep going for one more day, for just one more day. You just have to make it through the day. And that's all anybody really asks of you, is to just make it one more day. And that's all you have to ask of yourself. Because one more day is a lot easier than thinking about one more week or one more year. Just go one more day.
Oh, Ariel, I don't even think I have the words to tell you how much I appreciate this conversation and that you are willing to touch on all of these topics. And I'm just grateful that you're in this space and you'll continue to write and we get to be on this journey with you. So I want to say thank you for joining us today. And I really hope you come back soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Love Letters and Books, a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to follow, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can find me on both Instagram and TikTok at Love Letters and Books. And if you're interested in being a guest on Love Letters and Books, suggesting your favorite author, or just want to write in an original love letter to yourself or someone else to be read on air, please send me an email at lovelettersandmixtapes@gmail.com.